What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So as I have discussed previously on the channel, I relatively recently replayed the Fire Emblem Tellius Duology. And as I've already done a video discussing my thoughts on Path of Radiance, this video will be focused on the second half of the duology, Radiant Dawn. There are going to be some inherent spoilery kinds of things, although I am going to save as much spoiler talk on Radiant Dawn for the end of the video for those who want to avoid that. So a few background details about this most recent playthrough. Firstly, the difficulty modes in this game are infamously relabeled from what they are called in the original Japanese release. While I'm not 100% sure of the reasoning or purpose of this change, the fact of the matter is, in Japan, there is normal, hard, and maniac mode, which were then relabeled as easy, normal, and hard for the international versions of this game, leading to quite the shock for people who picked normal, expecting a pretty breezy time, especially considering the low difficulty ceiling of its predecessor, and then getting kind of the complete opposite of that. This time around, though, as a much more experienced Fire Emblem player than I was at the time of my first playthrough of this game, I did opt to play on the hardest difficulty, with a few small tweaks for sanity purposes, being the restoration of the weapon triangle, map affinities, and viewable enemy ranges, which are normally all deactivated in vanilla hard mode in Radiant Dawn. And this is done via a small tool included with the FE10 randomizer, though no actual randomization or other changes were done here. And my reasoning for restoring these things is I feel these are aspects that were changed that really just make it less fun to play, in my opinion. I really just wanted to be going up against tougher enemies without having to deal with core mechanics being removed, and therefore, in my opinion, removing some of the depth of strategy. Not being able to view enemy ranges doesn't really make the game harder. It just makes it more tedious in that you have to count out and keep track of how far enemies are. It's really not a form of difficulty that I think holds much merit in this style of game. And I think that rings especially true because Fire Emblem has long since not done this in their hardest difficulties, and I think that is the right call. The second major thing I want to say up front is that the save game that I used for this playthrough was one that I got off of GameFAQs, partially because I had played the PAL version of Path of Radiance, but the PAL version of Radiant Dawn had desynced cutscene subtitles, which was bothering me, so I opted to switch back to the US version here, but I unfortunately didn't have my save from a few years back to utilize for a second clear, and so this of course prevented me from transferring my actual transfers from my Path of Radiance run because the games were in different regions. In the future, I'm probably just going to play the US versions of both for simplicity's sake, but the main reason why I chose this save in particular was to make sure that I had the criteria from Path of Radiance fulfilled in order to get the extra Sorin scenes that can only be viewed under very specific criteria. Primary of which, that it has to be a second playthrough and that you have to have transferred an A support between Sorin and Ike from Path of Radiance. And then there's a bunch of other smaller things that you have to do in Radiant Dawn to fulfill this as well, which I will dig into when it is more relevant. Though I do realize that having max transfers on everybody is completely unrealistic and definitely made certain parts of the game easier, I also think that it's something that can help ease me into doing a transferless run, which is likely how I'll play it going forward. But at the same time, for reasons I will dig into, I am unsure that it made a significant difference where it really counts. This is definitely a contender for the most ambitious Fire Emblem game, period. While I do think in certain categories and at certain times, this game does get crushed a little bit under the weight of that ambition, I do still give it props for being as ambitious as it is, because despite its issues, I think it is still a great game in its own right. More directly in the presentation department, I like the sort of old-timey parchment kind of look that the 2D visuals in this game have. The cutscenes, on the other hand, certainly more ambitious, as is a running theme in pretty much all departments of this game, but the voice acting is still pretty rough. I don't hate it or anything, but there is definitely a reason why it's memed on so hard, with the one pretty major exception being the narration between chapters, which I think is pretty great. The main sticking point that I have with these narrations is that they often will repeat information that was already explained at the end of the previous chapter. I assume the intention is that when you're prompted to save before the next chapter, you would quit out, and then when you boot back into the game next time, you would get that narration kind of reminding you and catching you up to where you last were. But for me personally, I'm so used to playing up until you get to the base in the next chapter and then saving and quitting, so that repetition was like a little bit jarring because I just didn't remember that being as much of a thing my first time through. Now the music in this game I think is a pretty major step up from Path of Radiance, primarily because it sounds much more convincingly orchestral and less frequently has that sort of stagnant MIDI kind of sound to it, which is still present in a handful of tracks, but the soundtrack is so massive compared to the previous game that I think the overall percentage of tracks that have have that particular MIDI sound that I don't like is lower than that of Path of Radiance. Another nice touch in terms of the implementation of this soundtrack is that the map themes and combat themes continue where they left off previously. And I think that's great because it allows you to just hear more of these amazing sounding themes. I think that this game's soundtrack is among the best in the series, and depending on when you ask me, it might be my favorite. Now, even though I did discuss the battle animations pretty heavily in my Path of Radiance video, I'll reiterate that combat animations are just paced better overall. Could they be paced even better? They for sure could, but I think they're more interesting to watch, and you can kind of skip to the fade out at the end of them and through the EXP bar and stuff like that a little bit quicker if you want to, in addition to just having more options in terms of turning them off entirely and stuff like that. I left them on pretty much through the entire playthrough, with the main exception being one specific chapter for reasons I'll dig into later. Leave your guesses for which chapter that is in the comments down below. And I guess lastly, even though I think this goes without saying, the 3D assets and the maps and stuff like that look quite a bit better than Path of Radiance does. And of course, that's partially due to being on the Wii instead of the GameCube, but the GameCube is certainly capable of much better looking games than Path of Radiance was, in its 3D assets at least. So it's nice to see that improved and refined in this title, despite, or maybe even due to, still being developed for a standard definition system. As far as more general spoiler-free thoughts on the story and character side of things, there are some times where characters will strangely exposit things that were explained in the previous game. It is a direct sequel, so I kind of wish there was more trust in the audience in this regard. That may or may not be something that was changed in localization, because I know the Japanese version has some kind of extended script. It's something that I've kind of looked into, but don't know the exact details on, so I don't want to speak on it too much. What I can speak on, though, is that, in my opinion at least, the storytelling in general is noticeably weaker than in Path of Radiance. There is still plenty in here that I do like a lot, alongside a number of ideas that I think are really interesting in concept at least, but don't totally stick the landing in terms of execution. What I do appreciate most about this game's storytelling, though, is its attempts to provide new perspectives within the world of Tellius. You start this game out playing as the Dawn Brigade within Benyon-occupied Dayan, which was, of course, where the antagonist of Path of Radiance hailed from. And so it helps to further humanize the Dayan people, in addition to introducing a cast of mostly new characters. Though it should be noted that this game changes perspectives quite a bit. And I think that the ambition of that is really, really cool. But I think that this style of storytelling is also the cause of some of the storytelling blunders here and there. Although some of them definitely could have been avoided despite this shift in perspective. I'll save my detailed thoughts on that for later on. The base returns from FE9, and it largely functions the same. The main differences being the armory's inventory no longer rotates. It just simply adds to itself over time, giving you more reliable access to certain weapon types that you would kind of have to blindly stock up on when they were available in the previous game. And the shop in this game has an entire category that contains rare items that will rotate out regularly. I already dug into some of the changes with the skill system here in my previous video, and overall, as I stated in that video, I think that some of the changes that were made here make the skill system a little bit more interesting to play around with. Forging is now unlimited, assuming you have the funds to do so, as opposed to how Bex works in Path of Radiance, where you can distribute it to units and give them a regular level up. In Radiant Dawn, levels gained with Bexp give units 3 guaranteed stat points, which means that this Bexp is much more useful and valuable on units that already have capped certain stats, which will typically be their highest growth stats, in order to work towards capping some of their lower growth stats. You don't necessarily have to do it this way, but it is a very efficient use of bonus EXP, and Radiant Dawn is sort of all about stat caps, whether that's aided by transfer bonuses from Path of Radiance or otherwise. Your units will end up capping stats in some form or another by the time they naturally promote at level 21. And this also makes promotion items more valuable, since if a unit's already capped all of their useful stats, or maybe even all of their stats in certain cases, you might as well use a promotion item on them so that way they can continue actually gaining points per level up instead of essentially wasting that EXP they might be gaining. Speaking of which, I think this is the first and only game to have 3 tiers of classes per unit, which I think is pretty sick, even though a lot of the units from Path of Radiance start in their 2nd tier here, so it doesn't change a whole lot for them, but for the newcomers at least, it allows for a ton of growth potential, even if that potential is not, in my opinion, necessarily worth striving for. I of course have to mention the major change made to supports here. You now get to decide decide which two characters build support bonuses with one another. And for gameplay purposes, I think this is great. It provides a certain level of flexibility and decision making in terms of what bonuses you want to give certain units, who would be likely to be standing close enough to each other to actually make the most of those bonuses and build them up. It is unfortunate that this is at the cost of actual support conversations. Instead, you get these kind of generic one-liners between the two. Some of them here and there might be more unique, but it's just really not that interesting. And I know this bothers a lot of players, and it did bother me on my first playthrough, but now the way I think of it is that we're coming off of a very character-driven game in Path of Radiance, in addition to having base conversations remain here as well, which I don't know if that fully makes up for the lack of more traditional support conversations, but I do still think it's kind of unfortunate that Intelligent Systems wasn't able to capitalize on bespoke support convos between certain pairings of characters at the very least. I think the most notable change in terms of map design and core gameplay from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn is the addition of ledges, which provide a hit and avoid bonus to units that are standing on a ledge above their opponent. But units can also climb said ledges at the cost of 3 moves, so there is an extra layer of strategy when it comes to these, and I would quite like to see them return to the series at some point. This was also somewhat of an indirect nerf to mounted units, which were notably extremely powerful in the previous game, since it wouldn't make sense for horses to be able to climb up these ledges. Add to this that mounted units and flyers have reduced movement on indoor maps. It's just another consideration in terms of who you're going to deploy and how you're positioning your units, and not relying so much on those types of units that you might have in the previous game. Something that could be considered a positive or a negative depending on where you stand is the whiplash of difficulty this game has, in particular coming into part 1 of Radiant Dawn off of the minimal challenge that Path of Radiance puts up in comparison. And I don't mind playing a challenging Fire Emblem game, but I think the way that these early maps are designed for the Dawn Brigade end up feeling more puzzle-like than I prefer. I think what makes Fire Emblem games interesting a lot of the time is the variance, and a lot of these early maps are so small and you have such a limited pool of units, most of which result in a game over if they die, and this just really limits the lines of play you can really take. You're forced to keep dog shit units like Leonardo alive, where in any other circumstance I would be perfectly happy to just let him fall by the wayside and never use him again. And even once he did live past that chapter, I think he did end up dying not too long after he became a non-essential unit. In addition to there being units in these early chapters kind of specifically that are coded to not move at all, but I don't know how you're supposed to know that unless you've played this game many times over, which this is only my second playthrough. So I certainly could have played some of these early chapters faster or more efficiently or cleaner if I had known that this specific unit just doesn't move at all. If a unit is locked in place, I feel like there should be some kind of visual indicator of it's safe to move into this guy's range because he's not going to actually attack you unless you're standing right next to him. It is one of those things that I think lends itself to the frustration of many players jumping into this game for the first time. It raises, I think, an interesting question about difficulty in turn-based games, where much of that tends to come down to how many mistakes can you afford to make before being punished, or how badly punished are you for making each and every mistake. I think in a series like Fire Emblem, which at the time of this game's release was known for its implementation of permadeath, I think, yeah, you should be punished for your mistakes, and especially on the hardest difficulty, probably pretty heavily. Like, I don't know if you should lose an entire unit for like one small mistake necessarily, but it can often feel like that in part 1. Hence the kind of puzzle-like design that I kind of related to. It's punishing in a way that I don't think is leveraging the fact that this is a permadeath game where units should be allowed to die and you still press on. You defend your lord, in this case Micaiah, and then Soth is also a critical character as well. Not that he's gonna die very easily in part 1. I actually think Soth is a very good example of a Jagan archetype, very similar to my praise of Marcus in FE6. He is there to kind of soften up or clear the way for the rest of the squad, which are very weak and frail. Arguably too weak and frail, even though it does synergize with the narrative that they are kind of the underdogs trying to free Dayan from Benyon occupation and all of that. But from a gameplay standpoint, I don't find the Dawn Brigade to be all that fun to control. They are kind of just a way to get me through these chapters that are threatening them at every turn. And that, as much of an oxymoron as it is kind of fun in its own way. And then you get to part 2, where you're given much stronger units. It's also a much shorter segment of the game. Many of these units also benefit from transfer bonuses from Path of Radiance, since they were there. Assuming you used them, of course, or in my case, everyone came with transfer bonuses because of the save I was using. It does still kind of share that puzzle-like mentality, but it's more forgiving, I think, in a good way, in that your units don't die to like a single round of combat. That said though, because of these various changes of perspective across the various parts of this game, there is very limited unit availability for a lot of these characters, especially so for the Part 2 squad. Despite and partially due to that fact, I think it's still pretty easy to rely on the usual suspects, which is something that I already stated about Path of Radiance, but even here, lean on Soth for Part 1, lean on Har for Part 2. The Grail Mercs are disgustingly powerful in Part 3, but I find that to be more so cathartic coming off of the previous two parts, and it's not like Part 3 doesn't put up a fight, it's just that it gives you more of a power trip in the early chapters before really ramping up the challenge. Finally, to dig into why I don't think that transfer bonuses make that big of a difference, having +2 to every stat besides HP, which gets +5, is notable. It allows for units to cap stats more quickly, therefore gives you the option to promote them sooner if you're waiting for those stat caps, and just generally the overall power level of your units is higher. Where I don't think this matters so much is the fact that you have this limited unit availability, and because of that limitation, these bonuses mainly benefit the units that were already going to be good to begin with, and it helps some of the ones that need a little bit of assistance, like Boyd or something, actually kind of keep up with the rest of the squad as opposed to just falling off and arguably being not worth using in comparison to other units, like the aforementioned Har, who is just a much more reliable axe user for a number of reasons. Take Astrid as an example, who in Path of Radiance can easily snowball into being one of your best units, and because of Paragon, pretty easily reach max level and likely cap some of her stats by the end of the game, giving her those transfers. Even with max transfers on Astrid, she still can't really do shit in combat. It's just, I think, one of many instances where even with +2 across the board, it's just not enough to save even some of the best units from FE9 coming into this game with a much higher difficulty floor, let alone ceiling. I'm not trying to make an excuse of like, oh, it would be the same experience if I didn't have transfers. It's like, no, obviously not. Obviously it would be more difficult not having that +2 on many of my units, but I think in the long run, you would still end up capping their stats, which in theory wouldn't have happened as quickly without the transfer bonuses, but still would have happened by endgame anyway. And so then endgame kind of ends up being very similar to the gameplay of Path of Radiance, where you're throwing cracked units at the enemy and largely just kind of demolishing what you're going up against. But before I talk more about Part 4, I do think Part 3 is where the game really hits its stride and I think is a great deal of fun. Part of that is because it feels more like playing Path of Radiance. Not only are you in control of the Grail Mercs for much of Part 3, but as I mentioned, you kind of have this little bit of a power trip with the earlier chapters, and then it ramps up the difficulty much faster and much higher than what you see in Path of Radiance. And I don't want this to sound like a circumstance of, oh, it gets good after the first 15 hours. It is still a good game prior to this. It's just that, in my opinion, Radiant Dawn is a game that continues to escalate to be a better and better game as it goes on. The main thing I want to say about Part 3 in terms of the Dawn Brigade's return is that no, you fucking don't need Nolan and company for those chapters. Granted, I had transfer bonuses for Soth and Jill. Normally, I probably wouldn't be coming in with Soth transfer bonuses, although he is one of those units that doesn't get promoted for a long while, so it wouldn't be terribly hard to cap his stats, and he still eventually falls off despite having cap stats. Kind of another example of a unit that, while they do definitely benefit from the bonuses, in the long run, it doesn't really change much. And in terms of Jill, I actually find that even with the bonuses, you still need to invest in her pretty heavily to get her to be as useful as she can be. And I would have probably invested in her even more than I did, knowing what I know now about the rest of the Dawn Brigade. Give Soth a Beast Killer, have Jill handle another choke point, and hold out until the Black Knight shows up, and then because he can't fucking die, just have him handle pretty much everything else. It obviously doesn't hurt to have more bodies to throw things against, but training some of these units like Edward and Leonardo and Volug and whoever else, Meg, is such a pain in the fucking ass in Part 1 that I am likely in following playthroughs going to just use them as needed to chip things from range or maybe finish off units in order to just keep the bodies on the field, but not necessarily for the purposes of actually using them significantly. I actually came out of that Fog of War chapter with, I think, just Micaiah, Soth, Jill, Zahark, and Nolan, leaving the final Dawn Brigade chapter of Part 3 to be much more of a challenge for sure, partially because it's a defend chapter, but a lot of it was putting these relatively few, mind you, cracked units at choke points on ledges and stuff like that, and just doing my best to prevent the flying Lagoos from crossing through. And even then, if I had took any and all of the investment that I put into the units that had died into the units that didn't, I would have fared much better. And that just doesn't really bode well for the kind of variance that I'm often looking for in Fire Emblem from a gameplay standpoint. Going back to my thoughts on Part 4, I just found it to be kind of exhausting, primarily because these are some of the few, if maybe only, route maps in the game. The more Fire Emblem experience I gain from playing and replaying various games throughout the series, the more I hate route as a victory condition. It just becomes so tedious. You're throwing these cracked out units at opposing, I guess, relatively relatively cracked out units, but you're also given access to the Laguz royals like Tabarn and Nesala, who just kind of wreck everything that doesn't have a crossbow. There was still some strategy involved in terms of who you're deploying where, like making sure you don't deploy mounted units with Micaiah's army because they have a desert chapter and some other small things like that. Unfortunately, you're not really going to know ahead of time, which is kind of shitty. Once you get to the tower, at least, it does become more interesting, but I did find a lot of these chapters, due to the cracked nature of many of my units that I opted to bring, to be more of a formality than something that I was actually strategizing through. The Dagincia chapter is kind of the main exception. I unfortunately lost Har in my successful attempt, but I was kind of sick of re-rolling and was willing to let him die. Of course, Har is one of the best units, if not the best unit in Radiant Dawn, but he had already done what he needed to do. The chapters after are kind of back to being formalities. I think that's pretty much all I have to say on gameplay kinds of things. I think that a lot of the system refinements are nice and give you new considerations when it comes to the skills and bonus EXP and the incentives to gain said bonus EXP, in addition to the map design being very interesting in a lot of cases, but then also being kind of limiting in some other areas like the early chapters and unit availability and all of the things that I've touched on. So it ends up being kind of a mixed bag. I think overall I find it more interesting to play than Path of Radiance, because Path of Radiance is kind of like part 4 of this game the entire time, but even easier, whereas at least this game provides a level of challenge. Whether that challenge is warranted or well designed or whatever is up to interpretation, of course, and kind of does depend on what chapter we're talking about. I guess I failed to mention, for those of you who commented earlier, as far as what chapter I turned battle animations off primarily for, with the exception of part 4, which I think I just disabled because it was becoming a slog, but I was referring to the Fog of War chapter at the end of part 1 with the Black Knight. That chapter really accentuates the puzzle-like design in a very negative way. This is your spoiler warning for Radiant Dawn. I like the change in perspective that you have in part 1, being that you're playing as the underdog in a circumstance that you didn't really see in the first title. In fact, the circumstances in this game are due to the events of Path of Radiance, and I like that reactivity the narrative has to those events. It helps, obviously, that these games were developed as a duology. There's a huge bit of foreshadowing at the end of Path of Radiance where it would be weird if you didn't have this game as a direct follow-up. Although I do find it strange that Sephiroth just says all of that stuff out loud. So part 1 kind of sets up this differing perspective and then ends up ascending Micaiah to kind of this legendary status in her home country. In addition to Pellius, the supposed son of the fallen King Ashnard, ascending to the throne. Do in part 2 shithead extraordinaire Izuka, who is one of those characters where I'm just like, how the fuck can you not tell this guy is shady? Soth and Micaiah eventually get there, but just fucking look at him. And then Pellius is just such a meek, bitch-ass character, man. And I get that that's the point. He's supposed to kind of be a fragile ruler, very unsure of himself. That insecurity leads to him signing the Blood Pact, which obviously isn't revealed until later in the game, but it does kind of help retroactively explain his actions in part 3. The only other thing I would say about part 1 is I just don't really give a shit about most of the new characters. I don't think they do a great job of introducing them and making me want to root for them, especially compared to how the Grail Mercs were kind of set up in the previous title. Part 2 is a little bit of a non sequitur. I do like it quite a bit because I like Elincia as a character, and it's interesting to see the previously hidden heir to the Crimean throne getting constantly undermined by the rest of the court because she is so young and inexperienced and wasn't known to the public. All these kinds of things lead to a skepticism in her ability to lead, but the events of part 2 lead her to further strengthening her convictions and kind of give her an additional arc, or I guess an extension of her character arc from Path of Radiance. And so I do actually like part 2 quite a bit from a narrative standpoint, and like where things end up by the end of it too. But again, it does kind of feel separated and isolated from the rest of the game. Of course, it is all kind of building up to the Grail Mercs saving Lucia from getting executed. That cutscene is fucking awesome, despite the cornball voice acting. And much like I really enjoyed part 3 from a gameplay standpoint, I also really enjoy part 3 from a narrative standpoint. Skrimir is a much appreciated addition. What I like most about him is that Soren, of all characters, is the one to kind of break through to him in terms of strategy and tactics on the battlefield. And I like that the Grail Mercs do quite a bit of guerrilla fighting that I think lends itself to a much more interesting war story than just two armies clashing each other head on. Zelgius is obviously much more prevalent here. You get the sense that he's more so fulfilling his sense of duty than he is fighting this war because he wants to. I feel like more could probably be dug into regarding that side of things. And of course, Zelgius is revealed to be the Black Knight. I do still find it a little odd that he's seemingly just kind of bouncing between commanding the Benyon army and then like going to help out Micaiah on her front. It's probably the point in the game where some of the cracks start to show. You get exposed more so to the extent of the corruption in Benyon and the fact that the apostle was kidnapped and hidden away so that the senators could take over and start this war for the sake of their control over the continent. But it ends up feeding into what Ashnard initially wanted in Path of Radiance, being to awaken the dark god from Laren's medallion. And thank God he doesn't come back from the dead or something to like see his plan come to fruition. No, he was so fucking out of his mind that he was willing to start the war he did in the first game and lose in order to spark a bigger war that he wouldn't even be around to see. It's fucking insane, kind of in the best way possible. Of course, you get more backstory from Ashnard in this game. I think some of that stems from if you keep Pellias alive, but maybe Almeida exposits some of this in part 4 regardless of whether Pellias survives. And of course, you can only spare Pellias on like a second clear. It's not really New Game Plus because you don't carry anything over, but you have to start a fresh file from a previously completed save file in order to get some of these additional scenes, and that includes going for the bonus Sorin ending, which I found to be pretty satisfying to go for, but not satisfying to actually witness. There's just like a ton of prerequisites, some of which I find to be super easy, like deploying the Black Knight in the final chapter of part 1, and then some of them being very specific, like having Sorin initiate combat in order to speak with Micaiah in a specific chapter in part 3, and in that same chapter having Ike and the Black Knight fight each other, but without either of them dying. Actually, I think that that chapter would have been kind of a breeze, because I think you just have to survive for a certain number of turns. So going for these extra bits of dialogue and actually delving further into enemy territory than you have to made that chapter much more interesting and much more tense and strategic. But then you also have to have Sorin talk to Pellias in the final chapter of part 3, and that can be quite tricky, mostly because you're kind of on a timer. That timer being the number of units dying in that chapter. But because you have several armies that are out of your control, this can lead to the chapter ending before you can get Sorin to reach Pellias, because of course Sorin is a very low movement unit, and Pellias is on the other side of the map, surrounded by very threatening units. I think I had to attempt this 2 or 3 times to get it, and it was a little frustrating. Of course, if I had the foresight to give Sorin some kind of siege tome he could have used to attack Pellias at range, that obviously would have been better. But the actual ending itself, pretty underwhelming. Sorin is the son of Ashnard, and therefore the rightful king of Dayan, and I feel like that should be a more significant part of the narrative than it is. I feel like you get more from Sorin's supports in Path of Radiance, for instance. That said, I do find it actually interesting, the relations between the Dragon Tribe and Ashnard, and everything that goes down between them. Ashnard having a child with Almeida, using that child as a means to bait Rajayon to become his mount, because Ashnard just wants power, and so having a black dragon Laguz as his mount is kind of this ultimate flex of his power. But then that leads to Dagincia disowning Almeida, and the relationship between Kurth Naga and them, and Enna being with Rajayon in his final moments at the end of FE9. All of those little character connections and stuff I find very interesting, and I like that aspect of the story. I just wish it was more at the forefront and wasn't like so tucked away at the very end of the game. It's one of those major things that suffered as a result of the ambition of this title. I think that this narrative had more that it was trying to say than it ended up being able to say. And that's in a game that has quite the runtime, especially on hard mode, especially with animations turned on. I think it took me close to, if not maybe a little bit more than 60 hours or something like that. I just kind of came away from this duology replay feeling exhausted, even though I did overall really enjoy my time with these titles. Though before I wrap this video up, I do want to double back and talk about the Blood Pact thing. I don't hate the premise of there being blood pacts in this universe. My main issue with the Blood Pact is in its execution. Not just that it comes out of nowhere and therefore can feel contrived as sort of a sucker punch of why things are happening the way that they are. Also the fact that these characters just refuse to communicate with each other. And that I think more so stems from how the fuck these blood pacts actually work. They explain the details sort of, but they don't get detailed enough to the extent where I buy into the fact that Micaiah couldn't just tell like, hey, there's a blood pact, we can't do this, we got to figure out how to stop this, blah, 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 blah. That I think is more so where it feels contrived. How is it exactly that the owner of the blood pact is able to tell when the signer of the blood pact is breaking their deal? Is it a magical thing where the contract just kind of knows? Does it magically kill individuals in that nation, or does it release like some kind of plague? And is that again at the behest of the contract itself, or is it the contract holder? And then you also have the fact that Lacane just like has the fucking contract on him. This is played off as a symptom of his distrust and paranoia of those around him, but to me it reeks of just plain stupidity. Why would you not send this off somewhere the fuck else, so that way even in death this blood contract continues to persist and therefore actually prevents the signers of the blood contract from killing you? I don't think it ruins the game's narrative, but it is definitely something that I think is not well executed in the slightest. Of course, with Kill This and Nesala's signing of the blood pact, who I actually find to be quite compelling, you kind of view him as going to where the highest bidder is, but then actually upon discovering that he is beholden to Benyon because of this blood pact, it makes a lot of his previous actions make more sense. I'm not saying that it perfectly works, but it adds an extra layer and again explains away a lot of his shitty behavior in FE9 especially. Maybe he could be explored as a character more as to like why he would have done this in the first place. Not that anything can be done about this now, but more so in the pipe dream that would be some kind of Tellius remake someday. There's just like a lot in terms of this game's narrative that I think could be changed for the better. The core events that happen, I think, are fine. It's just in the execution of some of these finer details and how they tie everything together, I think is kind of weak, but still enjoyable, and I think still at the end of the day, satisfying. I think I actually come away from this most recent playthrough liking it more than I did despite its faults, even if those faults I think are more apparent to me now. I never would expect for this game to get fully remade, even though I think that there's a lot of potential there. At the very least, I think a higher effort remaster would be awesome, as it would be with Path of Radiance, but that's even unlikely in that game's case. But in terms of a high effort remaster of Radiant Dawn, I think there being options as far as the level of transfer bonuses you get could be cool, like allowing you to play with max transfer bonuses if you want to, or none at all, or just the transfers that allow you to get the extra story tidbits. That said, if this is a truly high effort remaster, it'd be great if they restore the extended script. Maybe that would help make the Sorin elements and the Blood Pact elements of the story feel more fleshed out and kind of cohesive with the rest of the narrative. I think that I will continue to play through these games every few years. I lean towards saying that I think Path of Radiance is the better overall game, but it also doesn't feel complete without Radiant Dawn coming after. These two games, be it individually or as an overall package, are some of the best that Fire Emblem as a series has to offer. Even though I think from a pure gameplay standpoint, there are probably some other titles I would rather play, but typically with those titles, you don't get as rich of a world or narrative coupled with it. If there's anything you guys want to discuss in the comments regarding Radiant Dawn or this duology in general, or Fire Emblem in general even, go ahead and leave a comment and I will do my best to reply in kind. Of course, I do want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.